So the news coming from the United States that the former Secretary of State of the United States has died today due to the complications of the coronavirus. Now, I'm not going to address this medical issue, whether he was vaccinated or not and all this stuff. I'm going to focus on Colin Powell's relations with Syria and his role in the mayhem that the Middle East is passing through today or suffering from. You may all remember that Colin Powell's famous speech in the UN Security Council, where he tried to convince the international community that Iraq acquires weapons of mass destruction, he acquires chemical weapons, and he's a few minutes away from launching missiles against American forces and their bases in the region, and that he's on the way of developing nuclear weapons, etc., etc. And the American public bought this lie. Let's be honest about it. And Iraq has suffered hundreds of thousands of deaths and millions of refugees and displaced Iraqis, whether inside Iraq or Syria hosted 2 million Iraqis. These are big numbers. We're not talking about a few people died somewhere, because during acts of hostilities and wars, of course, innocent people die, civilians die. But Colin Powell played an instrumental role in legitimizing the American invasion against Iraq. And the consequence of that was hundreds of thousands of civilians dead and millions are refugees. And nowadays you can just check the American media or the so-called journalists in the United States, and they're praising him, Colin Powell, as if he is some sort of a hero and a war hero, etc. Maybe for you in the United States he's a hero, but put yourself in the shoes of other people in the Middle East who suffered a lot, and the mayhem that followed the Iraqi war. Look, when the central government of Iraq collapsed, this paved the way for radical elements also to join the war in Iraq, such as Al-Qaeda, and later developed into ISIS. And the phenomena of ISIS, which started in Iraq, has moved later into Syria. So the war that Colin Powell started or played part in it, an instrumental part in it, has had its reflections and consequences and repercussions on Syria as well, after 10 years of the invasion of Iraq. Now, Colin Powell in May 2003 paid a visit to Syria. Syria received a lot of foreign ministers in the past decades, American foreign ministers, but this visit in May 2003 was very, very important because Colin Powell came after the invasion of Iraq and the collapse of the central government of Iraq and the occupation of Iraq as a victor. He was the victorious side, and he was threatening the neighboring countries that if you don't follow suit, then you're next. So Colin Powell came to Damascus from this background, from this perspective, from this stance of power. And he didn't come to Syria to tell the Syrian president that let's negotiate about certain arrangements. So as you can see, Iraq has fallen and we are offering you this, you may offer us that. No, he came to Damascus and in his hands are a list of dictates. And he told President Bashar al-Assad back then in 2003 that the United States is asking Syria to follow these steps or else. Or we will overthrow your government and we will repeat the Iraqi example in Syria. So what were these demands from the United States? The first demand was Syria needs to change its constitution, and especially Article 8 of the Syrian constitution, which says the Ba'ath Party is the ruling party of Syria. And they wanted to make Syria a pluralistic political system in order to allow the opposition and allow other parties, whether they are the Muslim Brotherhood, whether they are Kurdish parties, whether they are parties who are calling for separation, etc. They wanted to repeat the example of Iraq. The second demand was that Bashar al-Assad has to sideline the old guard in his government. The old guard means the people or the officials who were in the leadership of Hafez al-Assad, and they continued under the leadership of Bashar al-Assad. The third demand was Syria has to withdraw from Lebanon. Let's remember when Syrian army forces entered Lebanon, there were two things that are important here. One, it was the Lebanese government who asked Syria to come and try to end the civil war in Lebanon. And two, the Americans turned a blind eye to the Syrian operation in Lebanon, because both sides had also a mutual foe back then, which is the Palestinian Liberation Organization, the PLO. Syria didn't enjoy good relations with Yasser Arafat and his Palestinian faction. The fourth demand was that Syria has to end support of the Palestinian resistance and the Lebanese resistance and close their representative offices in Damascus. So you know that Syria supported politically and militarily, and in terms of training, the Lebanese Hezbollah and also Hamas, Jihad, Islamic Jihad, etc. in the past decades. So Colin Powell also said that this has to stop. And the fifth demand was that Syria has to minimize its relations with Iran in favor of other Arabic countries. Like they wanted Syria to be more into alliance with Saudi Arabia, Egypt, and other regional countries who are in alliance with the United States rather than with Tehran. The sixth demand was that Syria has to hand over the Ba'athist officials of Iraq who escaped the war and took refuge in Syria and Damascus. And the last demand was that Syria has to destroy its chemical weapons. And they were even bluffing about like, oh, maybe we didn't find the weapons of mass destruction in Iraq because these weapons were transferred into Syria. I mean, as if the weapons of mass destruction are candies that you can hide them in your pocket. And the Americans couldn't detect these weapons of mass destructions moving from Iraq into Syria. So these were the demands of Colin Powell to President Assad. Now, we are in 2021. Let's see what happened after the war on Syria in 2011. These same demands, the United States raised them again for Assad. And when Assad refused again, they started to finance and arm and train the radical jihadists in Syria. Now, it's true that the government of Syria, so if we compare these demands of the realities underground now, we will see that Syria changed its constitution and they abolished Article 8 of the constitution that says Ba'ath Party is the ruling party of Syria, but this is only in theory. In practice, the Ba'ath Party is still the ruling party of Syria. The old guard of Hafez al-Assad, they were already being sidelined by Bashar al-Assad, like Abdel Halim Khaddam, like Mustafa Atlas and others. Withdrawal from Lebanon. In 2005, the assassination of the former Prime Minister of Lebanon, Rafi al-Hariri, happened. And I am quite confident that those who are behind the assassination are the same ones who wanted Syria to leave Lebanon. Because what happened after the assassination of Rafi al-Hariri, United States, Israel, France, Britain, all these countries accused Syria of assassinating the prime minister. And now after how many years? 15, 17, 16 years of his assassination, There is no evidence that Syria assassinated Rafi al-Hariri, and nobody is talking about him. But it has caused Syria to withdraw from Lebanon because there was a big pressure on Syria back then, and they started to threaten Syria with invasion, and they imposed sanctions on Syria. And the general mood in Lebanon, because the media was very strong and they were inciting against Syria, and they were calling Syria an occupation force in Lebanon. So the Syrian army withdrew from Lebanon. So this demand will also now come true. Minimize relations with Iran didn't happen. Now relations with Iran is way better than before. Syria didn't end support for Hezbollah, but ended support for Hamas, because Hamas, for Syrians, Hamas betrayed Syria, and they sided with Turkey, Qatar against Syria when the war erupted in 2011. Handing over Ba'athist leaders, it never happened, and destroying the chemical weapons of Syria happened in 2013 and 2014. So as you can see, the legacy of Colin Powell in the region was very destructive. I could say with great confidence that there is blood on his hands. He helped destroying the lives of millions of people. He helped killing hundreds of thousands of people. He shouldn't be remembered as some sort of a hero. He should be remembered as a war criminal who even escaped any kind of justice. He escaped trial. I mean, of course, George W. Bush is now cruising and appearing on American media outlets as if he did nothing in the past decade, as if he didn't destroy the lives of the people. He is being praised also, and they're trying to polish his reputation and his name, because they know that sooner or later he will die, so let the people remember him as a good guy, right? But people also need to know that the leaders of the United States were pursuing a narrow financial and military interests, mostly dictated or asked by the military industrial complex in the United States, and this has cost the lives of millions around the world. The people of the United States needs to know this. The people of the United States has to act, and anti-war movements should gain momentum again. But unfortunately, recently, as we can see, the left in the United States has lost their path, or lost their sanity, and they're the ones who are more pro-war nowadays comparing to other forces. This is a very unfortunate thing. There are very little anti-war, anti-imperialist, and anti-war, anti-interventionist left-wing groups, not only in the United States but also in Europe. So this was something that I wanted to make when I heard the death of Colin Powell, but I'm going to also mention Colin Powell's statement in 2015 regarding Syria, and he says, he made a statement about Assad. I quote, "I don't like Mr. Assad. I have worked with him, tried to work with him, I should say." Of course, he didn't work with Assad, or he didn't even try to work with him. He came and with a list of demands for Assad. And he says, I quote, "And he is a pathological liar. He is a devil. I would like to see him live." When a person who lied in front of the entire world regarding the weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, and he helped killing hundreds of thousands of people and made millions refugees, he's calling someone a devil, and he's calling someone a pathological liar. It's really surreal. And maybe at the end the Assad curse is real, because as we can see in the past decade, most of the politicians and Western officials who said Assad must go, they either lost their jobs or they're dead. What do you think about it? Is the Assad curse real? Let me know in the comments. I've been your host, Kirill Kalmasyan of Syriana Analysis, and see you next time.